With the conclusion of YCS Pittsburgh, we finally have the first premier results after we just got that emergency ban list, and I think things are interesting to say the least. In today's video, I'll be going over each of the top 8 deck lists, and then going over some of the more interesting decks that also ended up making to top 32. This is meant to give you a general idea of some of the tech choices that are probably going to be more common in the metagame, as well as help you determine what the best decks are so you know how to build your decks accordingly for the metagame. But without any further ado, let's just jump straight into it with the first list. So the first list here, we have branded Draco tail, which did get first place. I think this is a fairly standard branded Draco tail list. Like, I'm pretty sure every ratio in here is cookie cutter, aside from the fact that he's only playing one copy of Urgla. This is something I've started to see a little bit more commonly now in Draco tail builds as they try to cram in as much non-engine as possible. In fact, like, this list is playing 41 cards just to fit in like the extra Magnemut. I think this version of the deck tries to respect the combo decks like Mitsurugi Yami a bit more than some of the more mid-range decks like Draco tail, since they are losing a big piece in the Draco tail mirror, but in return they're gaining more room for non-engine, which is going to end up being really good against the Mitsurugi Yami deck. The 6 Charmies in the side deck I think are also representative of that. Since a deck like Mitsurugi Yami is so hard to hand trap with like the fair hand traps like Ash Blossom and Valor, I think you kind of need cards like Charmies in order to really be able to hinder them, or at least if they play, you have a higher chance of drawing into your high impact non-engine like 5 mana. Something interesting in the extra deck is like no Mirror Jade. I don't think it's strictly necessary for branded Draco tail because the extra deck is slightly tight, and I think in its place he was playing a second copy of Secretarion Dragon, which is really nice in the mirror match because it lets you use your first Secretarion Dragon a little bit more freely. You don't really have to play very conservative with it and save it for the perfect time. If you play multiples of these, it's going to be a lot easier to just interrupt your opponent early on, and even if they out the first one, they still have to deal with the second copy of Secretarion in the mirror. I think this list was pretty solid going forward. Most of the Draco tail lists we'll see are pretty similar to this. Maybe there's some lists that are playing the Fallen the Virtuous, which we'll touch a little bit more on in the next list that we'll look at from top 4. Before we get to that though, I want to look at the second place list, which was Mitsurugi Yami. And again, I think this list is generally pretty standard in terms of the engine at least. Interestingly, they're not playing any copies of Kusanagi and Aramasa, and I think that's perfectly fine. This deck definitely doesn't need any of those cards to do its full Mitsurugi Yami combo. Those cards just kind of make the Mitsurugi side of the deck slightly better if you only see those. Outside of that, I think an interesting choice for non-engine was the Dark Ruler No More. Going this mix between like hand traps and board breakers, I think is something that we haven't really seen too much of before, since people were really fully committed to trying to full stop their opponent. Even though Dark Ruler No More isn't necessarily going to take out a lot of boards completely, it should allow a deck with this much gas to still be able to play through what's left relatively easily most of the time. So I think Dark Ruler No More was a pretty good choice for Yami Mitsurugi specifically, even though it doesn't really do much in like the Draco tail matchup. For the Draco tail matchup though, you can see they sided cards like Double Cyclone and Akroki. These cards are pretty good into that matchup, so I would say that you might be seeing cards like Double Cyclone be a little bit more common now in the metagame since Draco tail did just win this YCS, as I expect more and more people to try to play it. Similarly, Retaliating Sea is also in a side deck, and I think that's also a choice that we might see more of in the future. While it is a really good card, isn't necessarily always going to be an auto win either, especially if the Draco tail player knows what they're doing. But I think in terms of side cards specifically for Draco tail, Retaliating Sea is definitely up there. It's definitely one of the better ones. In terms of the extra deck, I think everything is fairly standard aside from maybe Gorgon and only 2 copies of Snatchy. You probably don't need 3 copies of Snatchy outside of like very, very niche scenarios. And I think giving yourself a way to out the Lunalite Liger Dancer in engine is something that's definitely needed over the course of a long tournament. And I will also talk about the Lunalite list that did end up getting top 8, so one of them did actually make it pretty far. For the rest of the Draco tail and Mitsurugi Yami list, I'm going to skim over them a little bit faster. Since I did cover them pretty in depth just now, the big thing that stands out in this list is the fact that they're playing 3 copies of Fallen and Virtuous in the main. This is probably going to be the biggest deviation in Draco tail deck building. There's like one camp of people who think this card is insane, it's great in the grind game, helps you dodge cards like Flame, but there's another camp of people like who just think that hand traps are just a lot better, since this card is just at best a 1-for-1 a lot of the times and isn't necessarily going to help you successfully break a full board if your opponent does get there. So I think there's definitely upsides and downsides to playing the Fallen the Virtuous. Personally, I'm siding this card for very specific matchups and just filling out my main deck to have the best chance against the combo decks, but I think that both approaches of building Draco tail are definitely valid. And so since they are focusing more on the Fallen the Virtuous, you'll see that their extra deck has a lot more branded cards. So like they're playing Mirror Jade again. They're also playing extra branded fusions like Titanic Clad, Rinbrum, and Dragon that Devours the Dogma. These will make it so Albaz is slightly less of a worse draw, because in the cases that you do end up drawing it, if you normal summon it, there's generally going to be a fusion monster that you're going to be able to make. Rinbrum's pretty good with the Following the Virtuous, since it does allow you to use Albaz as an interruption on your opponent's turn, and Dragon that Devours the Dogma can catch some opponents off guard if they don't expect you to play it. Overall though, I would say this list is more of the exception rather than the norm, because this player definitely chose to focus really hard on the Fallen the Virtuous, whereas most lists will kind of just slot it into a standard Draco list and not really change up their deck building in order to accommodate for it. And then moving to the top 8, the only non-Draco or Yummy deck was Lunalite. This deck is definitely still very scary, and I think every deck should at least deck build with this in consideration, because if a Liger Dancer gets summoned, then that's pretty much just the end of the game. There's nothing that a lot of decks are going to be able to do to it. I would say in terms of Lunalite though, this list is fairly standard. They are of course siding the heavy polymerization to go second, along with copies of Thrust, making it so they have that huge blowout card that will just pretty much auto win the game if it does get to resolve. I would say this list is playing a fairly high count of non-engine for a Lunalite strategy. They're playing 3, 6, 9, 12, 15 non-engine in Lunalite, which I think is fairly high given the deck's like high engine count. Interestingly too, they aren't playing Foolish Burial Goods as additional extenders and starters, which I've seen some Lunalite lists doing, so I don't know if that's going to become the norm or not, but I feel like overall this list is probably like the bare minimum of the level of consistency that you're going to need in the Lunalite deck in order to do well, because I think if you start cutting more starters like this, then the deck just becomes a little bit too inconsistent and starts falling apart. And then now I'll very quickly go over the rest of the top 8, which are just three Mitsurugi Yummy decks. There's nothing too crazy about this list. It's pretty similar to the second place list in terms of like its main side and extra deck, so nothing to really talk about here. In this list, we do see them playing Forbidden Droplet, which I guess is a bit more of an interesting card. It can be pretty good against the Draco deck. Not only does it give you additional ways to dodge Flame, it also stops cards like Arthalion from triggering when they summon it on your turn. Again, there's nothing too crazy about this list. It seems like Gorgon of Zilphonia is like pretty common in these extra decks. And then finally, the last top 8 list. This one is slightly different than the others. They were choosing to main deck Purulia, and I think that one's interesting because I don't know how good Purulia is into a lot of the metagame right now. It's pretty abysmal into a deck like Draco Tail, and while it can be solid against like Yummy sometimes, since Mitsurugi's also still running around a ton, I don't really know if I would choose to main deck the Purulia, but I guess it is an option. It still does match up pretty well into a deck like Malice, and like I said, into Yummy, it can be pretty solid. This player, interestingly, didn't choose to play Zilphonia. They chose to play Wosu in the side deck instead. Both are going to work just fine. Both of them are very easily accessible in the deck, so when you get to see Engine, you're going to be able to get to that Liger Dancer out. And now I'll talk about some of the decks that fell just outside of the top 8, but still ended up getting top 32, because I do feel like these decks are still significant contributors in the metagame overall. The first one is going to be Malice. Malice is definitely starting to see a resurgence now. There's like definitely a few upsides to playing Malice. People have started to cut Lancia from their side deck for the most part. This deck is able to play fairly well under most normal hand traps, even under a card like Fua. This deck is able to set up some pretty reasonable end boards, and they do have access to very powerful blowout cards like Shifter, Dimensional Fissure, and even a card like Dominus Impulse trades really well into the best decks in the format. So I think Malice is actually positioned pretty well in the format right now. Even though Malice didn't get top 8 at this event, I do think it's worth considering like putting Lancia back in the side deck, just because of how strong this deck can be when it just gets to go off completely uninhibited by a card like Lancia. In terms of the actual Malice deck list itself though, I think we're starting to see more copies of Allure, which is going to be more standard in Malice now, since they did lose copies of Dormouse, and so they need to see that extra consistency. Super Polymerization is interesting. I don't know if this is something that's going to be super common in the Malice deck, but in the Malice deck, they are able to take advantage of like any extra body pretty well, just to help them link climb to cards like Lizardos. So I do think that there is merit to playing Super Polymerization in this deck. This is a deck that is able to play a very high count of non-engine too. So I think that regardless of whether they're playing Super Poly or not, you should expect to face a ton of non-engine when playing against this deck, especially with cards like Chessy Cat and Allure of Darkness digging deeper into the deck too. In terms of the extra deck, everything is pretty standard. I think every list is ending on Allied Kotalker now. Back in the day when Malice and Raizo were tier 1, there was some debate between ending on Allied Kotalker or Bomber Dragon, but I think now the norm is definitely just ending on Allied Kotalker for that Omni Negate. And then next up, we have Vanquish Soul K9. And this is definitely a deck I didn't expect to do super well, but with the addition of Noroi and how powerful it is a deck that can sometimes function even without the Vanquish Soul cards being online. And of course, like 5 mana, Holly Stew is still one of the best turn 0 hand traps that we have in the game right now. So I'm not surprised that if there's a skilled Vanquish Soul pilot and they do have a good day in terms of like their draws, this is definitely a deck that can still do some damage in the format overall. In terms of the actual list itself, I think you'll probably expect most Vanquish Soul K9 lists to moving forward to max out on the K9 monsters in the deck, just because you aren't going to be consistently seeing like the right combination of Vanquish Soul cards a lot of the times. So you're going to kind of have to rely on getting the most out of like the other side of the deck, being the K9 cards. This player also did choose to play cherries, which I thought was interesting, and they only did it against Yummy. I think that's fairly reasonable. Draco is supposed to be a pretty good matchup for the Vanquish Soul deck, so they probably don't need a copy of Arthalion in there. But I just thought it was worth pointing out because cherries is not a card that you see all that often. We also had a pure Mitsurugi list in the top 16. I think the only really special thing about this list that's interesting to talk about is this water barrier statue. Basically, the way the combo works, if you end up not using your normal summon in the regular Mitsurugi combo, you'll end up having 2 level 8s on the board, which can go into Dragluxion. Dragluxion is then going to be able to add 7 Tachyon from your deck to your hand, and then you're going to be able to play that 7 Tachyon, revealing a water number monster, being Silent Honor Arc, to then add Barrier Statue of the Torrent from your deck to your hand, and then you can just simply normal summon onto your board afterwards. So basically, it's the same thing that pure Mitsurugi was doing before with like Gallant Granite searching Fossil Diana, except now they're summoning the Water Barrier Statue. You'll notice that we didn't see any of this in like the Mitsurugi Yummy decks, and I think that totally makes sense because the ceiling of the deck is so high. Usually it's just gonna win the games with its engine alone, versus like the pure Mitsurugi deck, like while its engine is good, without the Yummy cards in their end board is like fairly breakable by most competent decks. And so I think it makes sense for them to try to find this like sort of degenerate floodgate that they can supplement their end board with, and then make it truly unbreakable. Next up, we have a Sky Striker deck that did get top 16. It definitely struggles into cards like Droll and Lockbird quite a bit, so I feel like you do have to kind of get lucky in the sense that you're dodging all of the Droll and Lockbirds. But outside of that, like this deck has one of the best engines in the game right now at going second. Resolving all the striker spells for like additional value when going second is just devastating, and a lot of decks are not going to be able to keep up with that tempo. In terms of the actual list itself, I think this is your very standard cookie cutter Sky Striker list. There's nothing too crazy being played in the main deck or the extra deck. Side deck, Hamp, basically like Wosu for the striker deck. They're going to be able to search it and then have an out to Lunalite Liger Dancer. Interestingly enough, this striker player did choose to play some hand traps in the side deck and not just go all in on like board breakers like most striker lists do. That maybe caught some opponents off guard, because I know if I'm playing against striker in this format, I'm never expecting them to have any hand traps at all. In terms of the going first cards, like these cards are just make sense. They're going to be set off with thrust. Overall, I don't expect to see this deck continue to do super well. Maybe 1 or 2 will sneak into the top 32 here or there, but I feel like this deck is going to struggle at longer tournaments just because everyone is still playing Droll and Lockbird in their deck. Even though Mitsurugi Yummy was definitely the most popular Yummy variant and the Yummy variant that did the best, I think Soulful Cord Yummy is also a fairly competent version of Yummy that can see success in the future just because of how powerful a card like Happiness is. Happiness is probably one of the best extenders that we have in the game right now, just being able to spam out so many bodies onto the board, and they're all of ones, meaning of course they are able to get you into Yummy combo even if you just start with the Soulful Cord cards. Even though this deck's ceiling is, I would say, a little bit lower than Mitsurugi Yummy, they still are able to add things to the regular Yummy end board like the Soulful Cord Link 3, which will give them an extra Omni Negate, as well as Herald of Mirage Lights, which can give them extra interruptions as well. Even though they don't have the Mitsurugi cards in this deck is still able to set up the regular Yummy interruptions and couple that with like extra Omni Negations as well, so making it so their end board is also pretty solid into most of the decks that we have right now. And of course, because this deck isn't playing the Mitsurugi cards, there's gonna be less bricks that are really bad to see, because I believe the only like engine brick in this deck is like one of the Soulful Cord monsters, and I guess like the Yummy field spells, because the rest of the Soulful Cord monsters do quite a lot on their own. You're preparing for a tournament, I do feel like you want to prepare for Yummy Mitsurugi as the most common variant, but just be aware that Soulful Cord Yummy is kind of a thing. Although I think maybe the only thing to consider is they do have access to Omni Negate in their Link 3, and so you probably will have to use your cards like Nibiru at a different time than you would against like the Mitsurugi variant. And then next we have a K9 Crucian deck that did end up getting top 32. I think this list is overall very standard for like K9 Crucian as far as K9 Crucian builds go, but something that stands out to me is like they're not playing any of the Floodgate level 5s, like nothing like Spell Cancer that we were seeing in some K9 Crucian lists earlier in the stream. So I think that goes to show like this deck can still compete even without playing like the unfair cards like Mjolnir or Spell Cancer in their deck. I personally do think that this deck still does have quite a few issues with things like its grind game. It can be pretty bad into some of the Charmies, but overall I think that as a combo deck, this is still a deck that should be on everyone's radar. It is still setting up a pretty big end board that's supposed to be close to unbreakable, and plus this deck is still pretty good at playing through some of the more lower impact hand traps too. In terms of tech cards, Still Hat Rabbit is maybe the only interesting one. They're going to use this to set Apophis when they get to go first post-siding, and then from there, paired with Crystal Cluster, it gives them an extra negate off the Apophis to stop cards like Dark Ruler No More, which as we've seen has gotten quite a bit more popular. One extra thing this deck has going for it, it is able to search out Clockwork Knight with the Clockwork Knight link. It does act as a searchable floodgate against both Yummy and Mouse. And then finally, the last interesting list in the top 32, I think, is the Gem Knight list. And honestly, I'm pretty shocked because I think going second is so scary right now, especially if you're not playing like only hand traps. Like this list, you'll see was just playing the super high impact hand traps like Fua and Droll, and then just filling the rest of the deck with like normal board breakers. Against some of the best decks, like these board breakers, it can be really scary to just let them play the game essentially and hope to crack through the board afterwards. In terms of the actual Gem Knight engine itself, it is very compact though. Like you only have like a few key cards that you absolutely need to play, and then the rest of your deck can just be non-engine, which I think is really nice. And of course, going second, if this deck is able to just crack through an opponent's board, one single card can just lead straight to an OTK and just win them the game. Interestingly, in the side deck, they are playing a copy of Christia, so I imagine this is their plan when they're forced to go first post-siding. Having a floodgate which I presume should be searchable with some combo. I don't know the combo off the top of my head, but I imagine it has something to do with like the sprite cards as well as like Diviner and Crystal Rose, giving them a searchable way to just set up a Vandy's Emptiness and just auto-win them the game if your opponent just has no out to it. So while I still do think that Gem Knight is a very scary deck to play in the current format right now, I think this player did find a nice combo to utilize something like Christia to help them win when they are forced to go first, and they do play a high enough count of board breakers to where there is a chance that they are able to break through even some of the best boards in the format right now. Alright, so that's going to do it for this meta-analysis of YCS Pittsburgh. Let me know what you guys thought about in the comment section below. Are you interested in seeing more videos like this after every big event that we have? I'm curious to hear what you guys think. Overall, I think the metagame is in a fine spot right now, but I feel like we've gotten to a point where the floodgate problem that we were having in the last YCS has really died down. It isn't really prevalent in like a lot of the decks anymore. We'll notice like in all of the top 8 decks, there just weren't any of those like floodgate cards in there. There were still like the Mitsurugi list that was playing the water barrier statue. Now decks playing these like searchable floodgates have sort of become the exception rather than the rule like it was last format. So overall, I'm excited to see where this format ends up going. I do think that we are going to see decks like Draco and Mitsurugi Yummy continue to be good, at least until we get a new set or until the next ban list, but let me know what you guys think. Before I end off, I just want to ask you guys to please do me a favor and just check if you're subscribed to the channel. It really does help keep me motivated to keep posting more videos like this in the future, and it allows me to keep creating content like this to keep you guys up to date on the metagame overall. But with all that being said, I just want to thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next one. Take care.